Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Carper, for holding this hearing. Of course, you once again had a great panel. I'm sorry we did not have administration officials here, because when we've had them before us, we've learned a lot about what's going on, and frankly, I think we've been constructive in giving them ideas about what should be happening, in addition to what is already happening, both on the international side, the global threat here at home in terms of protecting the homeland, and certainly winning the hearts and minds, which has been a good conversation today. In Ohio, people are worried. I mean, they see what happened in Brussels. They remember Paris. They remember San Bernardino. And, you know, we're told by the national security experts here in Washington that the threat is increased, that here in the United States we face an increased threat. Today, in listening to the conversation, I would wonder whether you agree with that. Some of you seem to be saying that maybe recruiting is down, that ISIS is not being as successful because of some of the military victories. By the way, someone said they're by us. I mean, a lot of the military victories are by the Syrian army right now. We have to remember that. And there's some consequences to that may create even additional refugee flows, if that makes any sense, which I think it does. And so my question to you, I guess, is one, do you think that somehow the threat has ebbed? I don't sense that. And two, I'd like to dig a little deeper into this issue of the ideology, and I think there's more consensus, even though it's not entire consensus as to what we ought to do globally. There's more consensus about what we ought to do in terms of protecting the homeland. There's less about how do you actually get at the hearts and minds. One data point that has been reported to us, and maybe you would dispute this, but is very interesting as it relates to our conversation about what's happening here in the Muslim community and how we can thwart young people, the recruits, joining a misguided cause, is that 38% of U.S. citizens who have been charged with ISIS-related offenses are converts. So we sometimes talk about the lone wolf, and sometimes the lone wolf is a Muslim, sometimes it's a convert, but often it's a convert. So, I mean, I couldn't agree more that we need to do more in the Muslim community. Understand Mr. Watts's point about priorities, but I will tell you the first foreign fighter, I believe, who came back and was arrested here in the United States was in Columbus, Ohio. He was Somali. I've talked to the police officers there. I've talked to the Somali community. Part of the reason that we were able to apprehend him was because of a cooperation between the police and the Somali community. So very important. But is this figure accurate, that almost 40% of those who have been arrested here on ISIS-related charges are converts? And what does that mean in terms of dealing with this issue? Is it even broader than the importance of going into these Muslim communities and having that relationships and having the leadership in those communities providing that alternative path and letting people know that, as Mr. Watts said, I thought, well, these people are villains rather than heroes. So those are my two questions, I guess. One, what do you think about the threat overall? And second, what do you think about dealing with the challenge we have here in this country of people who are becoming radicalized, and particularly those who are converts to Islam becoming radicalized? And Juan, I'll start with you.
Senator Portman, thank you. Great questions, as always. First, I think the scope, scale, and sophistication of terrorist threats are more significant now than ever before. Part of this has to do with the diversification of the nationalities of individuals involved. Part of it has to do with the expanse of the geographies, with ISIS establishing these provinces, these wilayats, with several of these geographically now applying to ISIS to be a part of it. We've seen attacks in Southeast Asia as a part of the application process. And so the geographic scope, the diversity, the numbers are still there, and the sophistication of the operations are increasing. In addition, this is a group that is thinking about the next generation. And so you've seen recruitment of women, the attempts to engage in education and schooling, all as a way of breeding a new generation of jihadis and radicals as part of an ISIS 2.0, perhaps. Finally, the idea of the caliphate, even though it's diminishing in Iraq, the fact that it's beginning to spread in other parts of the world, and the very notion of it being a reality and persisting, continues to animate the movement in some very dangerous ways. And so I mentioned Southeast Asia. You've seen the reanimation of terrorist networks that we had worked so hard with our Southeast Asian partners and the Australians to suppress, now resurrecting because the idea and animation of the caliphate is driving some of these things. So I think we're in a more dangerous, animated time for global terrorism.
How about the threat here in the United States? How would you respond to that? Maybe, Mr. Watts, you could take a crack at that.
I would first note that we have a lot more ones and twos rather than community recruitment here in the States. And of those ones and twos, as you pointed to, many of them have deep psychological issues or maybe not part of this radical ideology for very long. And so how do you detect them if they're not part of a community and they're new to this movement? Many of the converts that are find Islam and then go to the extreme form of Islam and then mobilize to support ISIS, that can happen in months or years. And that's a tip-off that there's something else going on there. So the only real way to do that is online electronic surveillance. That's your best bet at picking those people up. They are self-radicalizing. They're motivating in ways that's very hard to detect. You don't have a community that can help you detect them. You don't have a law enforcement issue possibly that can detect them. So how do you do that? Your best chance is online, and then that comes to the point of how comfortable are Americans watching that. I am upset with the point that I'm no longer in government. I can sit at my house and watch extremists online and know that they're mobilizing towards Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or whatever group, but yet law enforcement in many ways has many more hurdles to hop over in order to monitor that sort of information. Oftentimes, I can provide it to them easier than they can go do it themselves. So I think it's how do we work through this system? That 40% worries me more because I also feel like they have a propensity to violence that's higher than the rate of many of the others, especially in the homeland.
Yeah, I think those are good points. Our time is expiring here, but one thing that we did not get into earlier in terms of the CVE issue is what's going on online. And, you know, our inability to counter that narrative in an effective way is a real concern. Even at our fusion center in Ohio that I visited recently, we're doing some of this, and that's very important. But it seems to me we should be increasing our efforts. As you know, this committee has talked a lot about this, again, with administration officials, and I think we've helped in a constructive way to nudge them toward more of this in a more sophisticated way to go online where those individuals who are maybe converts, maybe lone wolves, are finding this information. It's not a physical contact. The young man from Cincinnati who intended to come here to this Capitol, for instance, who was a convert, was working online to become not just a convert, but become radicalized. And I think this is an area where we have, unfortunately, a real gap in terms of our ability to project. And Ms. Smith, you have some background in that, I think. Do you have any thoughts on that, on our online messaging and how to counter message?
I would just note that we've seen different stages in how ISIS has kind of taken the fight away from the region and into Europe and now elsewhere, including the United States. They first wanted to inspire attacks. Then they have tried very hard to enable them, and now they're working to actually direct the attacks. And so our efforts to counter their efforts have to be driven towards every single one of those efforts through law enforcement, through the use of our military to get them back home in the place, the safe haven where they exist, but also the CVE efforts that we talked about. But you're exactly right. I mean, the online presence and their ability and their sophistication online is something that should worry all of us a great deal.
If I could add one thing, because I failed to mention it earlier with Senator Booker's question, was there are online CVE programs that I've seen that I do think have merit. One is called one-to-one interventions, online interventions. They've done that in the UK. Moonshot is a group that's done it. It sets outside of the government. I think that is an effective example of how you can do CVE in the online space. What tends to happen with investments, though, is that's more expensive because you're talking resources one-to-one, and we tend to shy towards, well, if we do this program with 10 people, it might reach 1,000. I would rather go heavier. I guess my response is heavier on those that we know that are closest to getting on that airplane or showing up here with an explosive device and invest a little heavier in those CVE programs. So maybe that's a better answer to the question.
Those individuals first,
yes.
You say, and that's one of our challenges. Once we identify them, I couldn't agree more of a targeted focus, laser-like approach. Thank you all very much.